yeah, hand over to Zanna. Thank you. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Classic mistake. Thanks, Lucy, very much for the wonderful invitation to speak at the University of Liverpool Evolution Anthropology seminar series. It's a great pleasure to be here. I was due to come in person, but obviously with the change in life circumstances, I'm doing it from my spare room. But no, it's really a pleasure to be here, and it's lovely to see lots of people interested in this topic. So hopefully today you'll learn a bit more about the kind of work we're doing at Durham, looking at the evolution and the development of empathy. Just as a disclaimer, quite a lot of the stuff I'm going to be talking about today is still in process. Due to the coronavirus, we had initiated a lot of new projects, but because of that, we're still kind of working on our projects that I'd sort of expected to be more along the way by now, but I think it's still a nice opportunity for you to learn a bit more about the kinds of things we're doing to explore this really, I think, really interesting and very important topic. So just to crack on then. So what is empathy? Empathy is, it's a word that most people will be very familiar with. And it's something that I think many people sort of have a sense of what it means. But I think it's also always important to sort of just start off the presentation with a kind of even playing field and think about what actually empathy is. So largely speaking, although there are many, many definitions of empathy, empathy is broadly considered to be the sharing and the understanding of others' emotions and their thoughts. It can be a bit of either, the sharing or experiencing of others' states and feelings, but also the understanding of those is considered the more cognitive component of empathy. Now, it's definitely not undisputed that empathy is a really important part of being a human. It's an essential kind of component to the way we interact with others, the way we feel about others, and some of the most meaningful experiences we've had in our lives are those forms of emotional sharing and feeling understood by others. It's really a critical part of human social functioning, and actually we know that where empathy fails at societal or individual levels, there can be a lot of negative fallout. So it seems to be that empathy is something critical in the sort of healthy functioning at an individual and societal level of our species. But that being said, given that we are indeed, we have a deep evolutionary history and we share many of our traits with other species, a relevant question is also, how did we come to evolve this remarkable capacity? And what could be the drivers of such a remarkable capacity in our evolutionary history? So key questions that people like Daniel Batson have asked is, how do we come to know or infer what others feel? What are the mechanisms, the evolutionary processes, the functions? And actually, why do we even care about others? Why do we care how they feel and think? And what even motivates us to respond to their needs? We often do it almost spontaneously, but what are the cognitive mechanisms driving our capacity to feel for others and share their experiences? So these are some of the kind of key questions that I'm interested in addressing at the moment, and I should think it will keep me busy for the next decade or so. So broadly speaking, empathy is divided into two sort of major components or mechanisms. Part of that is the affective component of empathy, which is more like the contagious experience or sharing of others' emotional states, such as, for example, contagiously laughing together, even crying together, that sudden feeling of sharing someone else's distress state or experience. That would be the affective component of empathy, probably not really under a huge amount of cognitive control, and also, and we know, has a deep evolutionary history, certainly beyond our species alone. The other component is the cognitive component. This is many different types of cognitive mechanisms might be involved in how we understand others' emotions and their point of view. The literal putting yourself in someone else's shoes and understanding why they might be feeling and what they might be feeling. And we know that this already is something that starts relatively early in human life, although the origins are still debated. But it's this cognitive appreciation of somebody else's experiences. So these are the kind of affective and cognitive components of empathy. There's also a key aspect of empathy, which isn't just the feeling and the understanding, but it's the doing. Empathy is an active experience or process. So it involves, really, true empathy does involve a motivation to act, a motivation to respond. And this is one of the most difficult parts to really understand in terms of the mechanisms that drive why an individual might respond to someone else's needs or experiences. And these are the kind of things we're trying to unpick in our research group. So in terms of the evolution and indeed the development of empathy, one of the sort of relevant models that's been put forward, not the only one, but one of the relevant models is Frans de Waal's Russian doll model. So I've actually worked with Frans de Waal for a number of years, and I will be talking about some of the research that we've done together and we're continuing to do together. And Frans's model is essentially the idea that empathy is a layered process, where at the base of empathy, you have a more automatic, evolutionarily very ancient mechanism of state matching. So that's the matching of a perceived experience in someone else with the experience in your own body. So there's this state matching. That doesn't necessarily need to be under any conscious control and can be an emotional contagion response. But then we get these additional layers of sort of complexity, or potentially more cognitively controlled parts of empathy, such as experiencing concern for someone else's needs, understanding that they might be having an experience of distress, and actually understanding what they need to help alleviate that distress. This is what you might call consolation, which is an expression of concern. And then like further up in terms of the cognitive complexity is sort of more emotional perspective taking. So that is really reaching out to help someone, understanding their needs and offering them the right kind of help for their specific situation. So this isn't just an automatic type of response. This is an understanding of that specific individual's needs at that specific time. So for example, if you imagine when somebody needs a certain type of help, they've fallen over, they've dropped things, you're actually experiencing what they need on their own basis. So it's that flexible kind of cognitive appreciation combined with an affective component. Now, a number of researchers are interested in understanding how these different aspects of empathy have evolved and indeed develop, and indeed even in this layered model is even appropriate, because there's a lot of interaction between these types of processes, both cognitive and emotional, when empathy is active. And it's certainly nowhere near being solved in terms of the neural mechanisms supporting an empathic response. So this is a multi-dimensional question in which we can only really contribute a small component. But I nevertheless think that apes and young children have lots to contribute to the interesting question about empathy. So now I alluded to this, that although empathy is something very special and widespread and complex in our own species, we also know that this remarkable capacity does indeed have a deep evolutionary history. Caring for others is not unique to our species. In fact, it makes perfect evolutionary sense that individuals who share close relationships with one another should be also attuned to each other's needs. So there's a strong driver for this, and there's been arguments that this might have evolved in the context of maternal care, where mothers have evolved mechanisms to experience and understand the needs of their offspring, and that it may have become extended to close social partners. And this is one of the reasons why empathy generally is more biased towards individuals that you know and care about. So you're more likely to respond to someone's needs if you share something with them, you're more similar to them, or you're more familiar with them, particularly your family and friends. Now, interestingly enough, although we find this in humans, and I'll talk about apes, we also find it in lots of other animal systems as well, including corvids and even rodent species, and certainly in elephants and a number of highly intelligent other species. But also we find it in there's possibly some evidence of it being shown in fish. In cleaner wrasse, there's some evidence now emerging that they may also respond to the distress states of their pair. So it seems that this mechanisms driving basic forms of emotional responding do indeed have a deep evolutionary history, and it's certainly warranted to try and understand these processes in much broader taxa than I can address in this particular talk. But I hope that at least I can contribute a little part of the puzzle with what I'm going to present today. So consolation is one of the things that I'm going to be talking about today, and some people have different terms for that. It has been called comforting or possibly sympathetic concern, but essentially it's operationalized as the offering of friendly contact towards somebody who's in distress after an experience of distress such as a fight. Now, many of us are familiar with this, but we're in our lab are interested in how this behaviour first develops in early life. And I think it's just always useful to show a little bit about what that kind of behaviour looks like when comforting happens. And for example, in a developmental sample, how young children start to show these behaviours. So I just wanted to show you a quick video taken by my colleague, Deanne Ostry, who is doing a PhD with me, of some young children in a nursery in the UK responding to each other's distress. So you'll see someone fall over, getting very upset, and hopefully you'll see, if the video works, you'll see the response of their peers. So let's hope it works. First postdoc to look at the occurrence of this behaviour in non-human primates, specifically in grey apes, our closest living relative. So again, we've been studying aggressive interactions and the responses of bystanders towards those victims after fights, because this is a really good context to explore emotional experiences in response to someone else's distress. So in this video, you'll be able to see, I hope, a poor, unfortunate victim being attacked by a bigger female. And if you can keep an eye, there's an individual on the right-hand side who will rush over towards that victim if the video works. And then I'll walk you through it in case it doesn't work. And there's also another individual in that video who you can see to the top right as well. So these are two bystanders to a victim who's going to be attacked. And hopefully you'll be able to see what happens to that victim. So I will just play it now and hope it works. So that's the aggression. Someone's observed and they can immediately approach the He has independently approached her and he's offering her a friendly embrace.
Miss Cece just got grasped by a parlour there. Holly's immediately come. It was...
And she's hugging him.
A parlour intervened on the behalf of Holly. Cassandra was there in 5.
And you can see there's someone else who's approached as well. And now if you look what he's about to do, he's tugging on her head.
Cassandra's approached as well.
And she's actually moving to hug, and noticeably he's approached to sit next to her, and he's actually sitting close to her as well. So these are quite classic, what we call consolation behaviours in grey apes. Someone approaches to hug, and they approach to kind of tickle and sit nearby. So this to us is the relevant behaviour that indicates that they're trying to reduce the distress state of the victim. Now, you could say there are lots of reasons why they might do this, but we've actually looked in our research to actually try and understand the mechanisms for why they do this. And the best explanation is that it's not driven only by personal gain, but is also driven by a motivation to relieve the distress of someone else. So, for example, we found that we use what's called the post-conflict match control method. And here you can see on this graph, the black, the one with the big peak there is the post-conflict period, and the grey at the bottom is the match control. And this is the amount of contact initiated by bystanders towards victims in the immediate period following a conflict. So you can see there's lots of approaches in that first period. And we've got additional results showing that from self-scratching data, that actually receiving that contact does reduce the victim's distress state, or at least their measures of anxiety. And we've actually been able to exclude alternative explanations, such as being the bystander's own benefits don't seem to be clear. In these, for example, there's no real relationship with them receiving aggression themselves, or so on. So it seems to us that this does seem to be effective in reducing distress, and it's also very biased towards kin and close social partners. So these are individuals that the bystander is more likely to approach victims with which it shares a close relationship, again predicted by the empathy explanation. So been in this behaviour for many years, and where I'll present to you some of the research that's sort of been developing about what this behaviour might be telling us. So, you know, just to take a step back, why is it really sort of relevant, you might ask, to study empathy in our great ape relatives? Well, to me, there's lots of reasons. Of course, these great apes are very interesting in their own rights. They've got very complex social lives, social structures, which really could have driven, you know, there's this close relationship between social and emotional skills and cognitive functioning. And I think apes possess very sophisticated abilities in all of them. And so they offer us a really relevant model to look at how complex processes like empathy might have evolved. And obviously, as our closest living relatives, great apes, in particular chimpanzees and bonobos, our closest living relatives of the great apes, offer us a potential window into the kinds of capacities that we might have exhibited before we had evolved into being fully modern humans. Because of course we do share a close relative with, we share a common ancestor with great apes, with which we split around 7 million years ago, or 5 to 7. So we can actually try and understand what their capacities are, what our capacities are, and what the shared capacities may have been before we became human. So of course they're not an ideal model, but they're the best model we currently have in terms of trying to understand our evolutionary past. So yeah, on that note, bonobos is the actual species that I work very frequently with. In fact, I've pretty much, I think all my research to some extent has involved bonobos in some form, at least, or at least chimpanzees as well. And I study bonobos and chimpanzees because of these reasons, but I also think bonobos are particularly an interesting species to study the evolution of empathy, because they also exhibit a number of capacities and tendencies in their own behaviour, which seem to show quite compatibility with our own emotional and social functioning. So bonobos show high levels of social tolerance and low levels of aggression, which are social conditions which could promote emotional sharing with others. We know from a number of experimental studies that they show particularly strong orientation towards social and emotional situations and emotional expressions. They also interestingly show a suite of neotenous or infantile features that seem to be linked to a process of self-domestication. Now, I won't have time to talk about this here, but there's a large sort of growing body of scientists that argue that humans have also gone through a process of self-domestication. And although the two processes are probably likely very different, there seems to be a selection in both humans and in bonobos towards friendly behaviours. And pro-social sort of behaviours. So rather than necessarily selection against aggression, there seems to be a selection towards friendly features, which coincides with the appearance of more juvenilized or neotenous features. And along with that, their brain structures also do support greater neural activation and higher neural density in neural areas associated with emotional processing. So it seems that they are an emotionally sensitive species, so they are of relevance for us to understand some of these processes. We of course do also study this in chimpanzees as well, who again are extremely complex socially, emotionally and cognitively, and we're actually in the process of trying to compare these two apes to understand the similarities and differences in our close relatives. So the research that we've done over the years has largely taken place at Lola Bonobo Sanctuary, which is a sanctuary in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where they have basically they've rescued many orphans from the bushmeat and pet meat trades, and they have rehabilitated them in these marvelous forested sanctuaries where they live in these 3 large enclosures in the DRC, and they grow up in large social groups following a period of rehabilitation. So it offers us a really nice situation to be able to see and observe them at close distance, which is not trivial if you're trying to study wild bonobos in the rainforest. We're trying to also study consolation in the rainforest, and I can tell you it's extremely difficult. But in the bonobo sanctuary, we get much better visibility. So that enables us to understand processes more clearly. Of course, we do need to do the follow-ups in the wild as well, but it gives us a great starting point. Now, as I mentioned, these bonobos at this sanctuary are actually many of them orphans. So they've come from the wild in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where they unfortunately have lost their mothers, typically as a result of bushmeat. So the photo you can see here is a very unfortunate photograph of some primate species smoked on a market in the DRC. This is a very, very large problem in Central Africa. The combined trade of bushmeat of parents or adults and the trade of the offspring as pets into the illegal pet trade. Now, this is obviously completely illegal, but it's a widespread problem. And Lola Ya Bonobo Sanctuary is actively trying to work on improving the legal and protected conservation status of apes, as well as rehabilitate them. So if you'd like to support Lola, I would also just say that you can, LolaYaBonobo.org have a wonderful fundraising platform that you can access online if you would like to support the sanctuary. So many of the babies, they arrive after probably witnessing huge trauma, and we know many of them have been held in very, very neglected and malnourished and deprived situations. And they get rescued and taken to the sanctuary where they're given a substitute mother, a human substitute mother, who spends time with them and helps restore their sort of social and emotional bonds. And then eventually they are reintroduced back into a social group where they end up being with other bonobos and living, in these nice enclosures. But it's nevertheless obvious that they have gone through a period of profound, probably neglect and trauma in their early life experiences. And so we're interested really in how that's impacted their social and emotional functioning. Now, we know in human development that early adversity, particularly deprivation, abuse, trauma, neglect, these all have a negative impact, typically profound, on social and emotional development. It does depend on when the deprivation happened, how long it happened, and in what situation. But there's large-scale evidence that across life, young children that have experienced early neglect never fully recover their social and emotional functioning, although they do seem to recover aspects of their cognitive functioning. So it seems that, and we also know, for example, from the Harry Harlow studies, which are the poor unfortunate monkeys who were removed from their mothers when they were very, very small, also showed profound social and emotional functioning issues. So it seems to us relevant to consider this developmental impact of early deprivation when trying to interpret the results for looking at empathy in these sanctuary living bonobos. So taking that into account, I'll now walk you through some of the research that we've been doing at the sanctuary, looking at the impacts that early life experiences have had on their social and emotional functioning, and also some research that we're continuing to do across their lifespan. So first of all, this is a graph that just shows some of the early stuff we've done on looking at how consolation exhibits itself across age classes at the Bonobo Sanctuary. So the black bars are the tendency to offer consolation, and the grey bars are the tendency to receive consolation. Now, as you can see, for the adults and adolescents and juveniles who are orphaned who lack a mother, there's typically relatively low levels of both offering consolation and receiving consolation for the average number of events. But when we also compared that juveniles who were actually reared at the sanctuary by mothers. So these juveniles were the offspring of former orphans who have actually been brought up and raised in the sanctuary among big social groups. These young juveniles exhibited a very different pattern than the orphans. In fact, they exhibit very high levels of consolation, much higher than what they receive. So they seem to be proactively consoling others in their social groups. But it seems that there could be this interaction between rearing and age, where we've got young individuals who are reared by their mothers showing much higher levels of consolation compared to their peers who are orphaned at an early age. Now, we also compared we've also actually had a chance to look at this, so I'll just go back, we had a chance to look at this developmental pattern because it's really of very interest to us to understand what's happening in this early life stage in apes, and not only bonobos but also chimpanzees. And actually Christine Webb, my collaborator, has got some very nice data from chimpanzees across the age span, which shows the exact same pattern as we found, where infants and juveniles are the most likely to console compared to adolescents and adults. So the youngest individuals in the social group are the most proactive in responding to others' social and emotional needs. This opens a lot of questions as to what mechanisms might be driving why such a young individual is motivated to respond to someone else's emotions. And actually this is work that we're also working on with my colleague Jake Brooker, who's doing his PhD with me here at Durham, is to understand this developmental tendency across the age span in chimpanzees. And again, there could be many reasons why young apes are responding much more strongly to the emotional distress of others. It may not indeed be cognitive. It could, and the current hypothesis we have is that there probably is a deep affective tendency to respond to others' experiences, which is possibly overlaid with a cognitive appreciation, which kicks in later on. But that in these socially complex species, such as bonobos, chimps, and humans, there is already in place a strong emotional drive to connect with others and respond to their states. And indeed, we also know that in neurodiverse samples, such as autism, that affective forms of empathy are also preserved. And in individuals who, for example, struggle in other areas with language and cognition, their emotional forms of empathy tend to be present, even if cognitive forms are more impaired. So again, it seems that this affective basis of empathy is very deeply rooted, and it might emerge first, both in evolution and in development. So again, work in process that will hopefully get some data from the chimps, which Jake is working on at this very moment, thanks to our grant that we got with Christine, Franz and Jake from the John Templeton Foundation. So onwards and upwards. So I've done a series of studies in collaboration with Franz de Waal and others to look at the development of empathy or consolation in a set of mother-reared and orphaned juveniles at the Bonobo Sanctuary. So these little orphans, these cute, this cute photos of all these young ones, they're actually now approaching adulthood. But when I did this study, they were all orphans and they were all juveniles that were either orphaned or mother-reared. So we compared their social and emotional skills at this age point with the prediction that orphans were going to be struggling in all components of their social and emotional functioning compared to the mother-reared who'd had typical maternal attachment. Now, indeed, that is what we found. So we found that in these young bonobos at juvenile age in the sanctuary, their social skills predicted their consolation tendencies. So here is a strong correlation between a composite sociality index, which we calculated based on different aspects of their social functioning. And we looked at that in comparison to the tendency for those individuals to offer consolation. And you can see a very noticeable fallout between mother-reared, showing high levels of social functioning and high levels of consolation, and orphans showing low levels of both. So they were lacking social they were lacking social affiliation, and they were also consoling much less. We also found at the same time, we looked at other components of their social and emotional functioning, such as how long these young juveniles would spend playing, how long those playbouts lasted, the number of affiliative partners they had, and indicators of their anxiety, which is through self-scratching. The grey bars you can see are the mother-reared individuals in our sample, and the black bars reflect the orphans of the same age. So what you can find is that essentially orphans are playing less, they're playing for shorter periods, they've got fewer social partners, and they're self-scratching a lot more. So they're showing these high levels of anxiety along with other features. Now we've had the opportunity though to actually understand, going back to this, we had this sort of story at this time that yes, early life adversity impacts social and emotional functioning, including empathy. That empathy is essentially dependent on these early life experiences. But of course, we've had the fortune to carry on following these individuals. And actually, 4 years ago now, it's kind of crazy to think this as time's passed, I was working, who is now my colleague Stephanie Corden, who's doing a PhD with me, but at that time was doing her master's. Stephanie and I worked with Frans de Waal to actually do a follow-up with these same orphan and mother-reared juveniles to look at their social and emotional functioning at adolescence. And now Stephanie's looking at their social and emotional functioning at adulthood, and we're trying to understand the life trajectories of these different groups. So one of the questions is, do we see continued impact of early trauma, or is there any evidence of recovery with time? So when these individuals get older, do we see changes in their functioning? Well, we also wanted to know if the same results we found with that cohort would be replicable with a new cohort of individuals of the same age and the same rearing situation. So we studied the same individuals 4 years later, and in fact we're just completing the analyses for the second round, that's 8 years later, to look at the longitudinal trajectory of these processes. What did we find? Well, in 2012, we found this big difference between mother-reared and orphans in their consolation. But actually, as you can see on this graph, by the time that these individuals get to adolescence, we no longer see this effect. In fact, we see that the adolescents and the adolescents in the 2016 bar were the juveniles in 2012. So they've pretty much leveled off. But intriguingly, what you can see is that the new juveniles are showing the same effects as the previous cohort of juveniles are. So it seems that this result is stable, but that something's happening across development that shifts from these rearing differences across age. So I think it just shows to us that you really do need to study animals across a longer period than just the period you're interested in to understand the trajectory of their development. We also found, for example, at 2012, which is on the left at the top, that's the correlation between composite sociality index and consolation. And on the right is what happened when we looked at that same data set 4 years later. We found no such correlations. In fact, we found a complete mess, that some of the orphans were doing much better than they used to be, and some of the mother-reared has actually declined. So it really paints a complex picture of what's happening in this across this life period. In 2011, 2016, we also showed again that number of bonded partners and self-scratching didn't show the same effects in the later time period that they had originally, which again suggests to us that some individuals are on very different life history trajectories than others. And although bonding early adversity does impact them at an early life stage, there appears to be some improvement, and certainly larger scale individual differences start appearing as they are starting to get older. So it does sort of suggest to us that they might be rehabilitating, that possibly early life experience before capture might be improving their overall life history development of empathy. It could be that they're just developing a better social network across time. But we also have noticed in this new period, which we're now collecting in adulthood, that some of these issues have not actually resolved. And actually at adulthood, some of their social integration is now becoming again a problem. So some of those early orphans who seem to show an improvement in adolescence are now starting to show renewed social problems at adulthood. So I think what we're trying to do is really understand how all of these different features interconnect. And that's the task of Stephanie's PhD, is to really understand the features and factors which can predict and understand better why some of the orphans in our sample have been improving, and some of them have actually continued to show challenges or even renewed challenges in their longer life history success. it is indeed important, because some of these orphans in the sanctuary are actually being rehabilitated to the point that they're now being reintroduced into the wild. So some of these orphans in these photographs have now been reintroduced. That one in the middle you can see grooming, she's now living in the wild. So it's a great success story for her, but there are other individuals in that group that have not yet showed the same level of improvement. So we really want to understand what is motivating these changes. So that's work in process for Stephanie and myself. So moving on now. We also are interested in whether or not victims can actually not only be consoled by bystanders, but whether or not victims are actually able to potentially control or enhance their chances of being consoled by someone. So rather than them just being emotional messes, is there any signals that they, for example, produce during during a distress phase, which could promote the occurrence of consolation? So this is work that Rafaela Heeson is doing with, Rafa's doing a postdoc with myself in our lab, and Rafa's been doing some really wonderful analyses to look at the production of signals by victims following a fight to see what predictors might predict consolation. And Rafa divided the signals into, she divided the signals into three main types. Pedomorphic signals, which are juvenilized signals such as pouting, whimpering, crying. Aggressive signals, which is, for example, she looked at victims when they produce barking, stomping, slapping, which they do, and then affiliative and submissive gestures, or such as baring your teeth. And actually, Rafa and I have been exploring this in this data set along with Diane in our group, to actually understand what the signals are. So I'll just play you quickly a video of a bonobo having a tantrum after an aggression. Hopefully you can see. Shaking her head. This would be called a tantrum. Someone has approached the scene. So she's got a response there from somebody who's approached her after she's produced a rather elaborate set of signals. So Rafa's actually been, Rafaela's been analysing and made some predictions about the types of signals which victims produce following a conflict to see what predicts consolation. So we looked at the occurrence of submissive, aggressive and pedomorphic signals and whether or not they predict the occurrence of reconciliation, consolation and further aggression by the aggressor. And our predictions was actually that potentially pedomorphic or submissive signals are most likely to trigger a consolation in bystanders, whereas aggressive signals are more likely to trigger, to reduce the chances of renewed aggression following a conflict. Now, what we actually found, and these are work in progress, is that the use of pedomorphic signals, so that's the use of juvenilized signals, which essentially resemble juvenile signals such as pouting, whimpering. These are the kinds of behaviors, tantrums, which predicted consolation happening. So when individuals, victims, produced these kinds of pedomorphic signals, they were more likely to be consoled than signals that were aggressive or submissive, which again was interesting to us because it suggests that the victims may have some degree of control over the kinds of signals they produce. And we actually got a whole other set of analyses which we're working on to suggest that they are indeed sensitive to the audience when they're producing these signals, and that they might be actually tailoring these to the presence of certain individuals in their parties. Again, this is work in progress, but I just wanted to bring your attention to it, to watch this space when hopefully the results come out soon. We also found that pedomorphic signals not only enhance consolation, but they also enhance the tendency for renewed aggression to decrease. So if you produce juvenile signals as a victim, you're less likely to be attacked by the original aggressor. So it seems that essentially behaving like a young juvenile when you're a victim is more likely to reduce the chances of receiving further aggression and increase your chances of receiving consolation. So again, it seems there's this complex interplay between victim signaling and the responses of bystanders. So again, this is work in progress, but I would hope that soon we will have some really nice results to be able to publish. So onwards we go. So now I'm just sort of going to spend the last few minutes of my talk talking a little bit about some of the other work we're now doing, because I've actually been given the fortune to receive the European Research Council grant, a starting grant, to do a big project to look at how empathy develops, not only in sanctuary living animals, but also in wild individuals. So we're actually now in the process of trying to take some of these findings from the sanctuary to actually study it in wild great apes. So my colleague Marie Poiret she's actually doing her PhD with me, working at Wamba, to actually study these infants all through their lives, from their first period of being born to, you know, until they hit juvenile stage, to understand the relationship between their maternal experiences and caregiving experiences and their milestones in social and emotional development. This is a big project, fortunately a bit scuppered by COVID, but we are still in the process of collecting these data, and we're super excited to see what Marie is going to find. And we also have some collaboration to also explore this in chimpanzees. So we've got some really exciting new directions for this project. Now, of course, observations cannot address all the questions that we want to address. So we're also doing a number of experimental studies, also funded by the ERC, with my colleague, Dr. Chris Crepena, who is an expert in experimental techniques with great apes, particularly eye tracking. So we actually are using new experimental techniques, the use of pupillometry and thermal imaging, eye tracking and behavioural experiments to understand the affective and cognitive components of empathy. So we're trying to basically use non-invasive experiments to try and get at some of the mechanisms which might be driving the performance of these kinds of behaviours in the real terms. So, for example, we can use eye tracking to look at the kinds of interactions which animals are interested in, what they understand, and things like pupillometry, which is the changes in pupil size, to measure their emotional responses to different kinds of emotional stimuli. So this is just exciting directions that Chris and myself and other team members are working on. Now, we also have been doing and bringing in this new technology, which is called infrared thermal imaging, which my colleague Deanne Ostry, again, she's been doing her PhD on this, a difficult PhD, to use a new technology, which is thermal imaging, which is these pictures at the top there. And essentially, Deanne's been doing work, and we're carrying on that work in the ERC grant, to actually use this new non-invasive contact-free method to detect emotional responses during these kinds of emotional, when they observe the emotions of others. So Deanne's actually conducted research both with chimpanzees and children, where she's presented them with conspecifics, so chimps have seen chimps, children have seen children, children have seen adults, human adults, and we've used the thermal camera to detect changes in their nose temperature, which can give us an indication of their internal arousal response. So typically a change or a drop in nasal temperature suggests to us that they're having a strong emotional reaction to that stimuli, even if we don't see a strong behavioural response. So we've been presenting them with conspecifics in distress, and I will just show you quickly a video and in other controlled situations, and you can see a behavioural response at the bottom and a thermal response at the top. So hopefully that will work, so you can just get a little indicator of the kind of experimental paradigms we can use to address the arousal responses using behavioural and thermal measures. So let's see if it works. Okay. So this is the video of someone in distress, which children observed, and then we then used the thermal camera to measure their affective response, and the video to also measure some of their facial expressions and behavioural responses. So really, just to summarize as well, just before I finish, we are also doing, as part of this project, we're looking at the development of empathy now across cultures. I'd be happy to talk to you about this, but we've actually run out of time. But we are doing lots of research to look at children growing up in different cultures and different societies, different environments, how they develop empathy, and how caregiving and cultural practices, cultural socialization of empathy might vary and impact on their empathy development. So this, I'm working with Carlo Vraden, Liz Renner, and colleagues in the University of York, Katie Slocum, and in Emory, Philippe Rochat. And we're doing some big scale projects to look at how children's early empathy develops in Samoa, hopefully Uganda and the UK. And again, this would be a whole separate talk, but I would love to talk to you about it. But in the interest of your lunch and the rest of your day, I shall not. But I will. We have lots of new research to present about that project, and hopefully we'll get a better picture of what are the predictors and the factors which shape how and why young children develop empathy and how it compares to great apes. So just to summarize there, comparative approaches do really reveal to us deep foundations of empathy and evolutionary continuities. And that actually we find that empathic responding does seem to emerge relatively early in development in both great apes and in humans. It seems that indeed, like young children who've experienced trauma and neglect, early experiences do impact the early social and emotional functioning of great apes, but there seems to be some scope for improvement across age, though we don't still yet know, because we still need to study these individuals fully in adulthood in order to understand the full scope of their changes and their developmental profiles. But I think also I'm excited because there's lots of scope for the new application of methods such as thermal, such as eye tracking, and this integration of observational and experimental approaches, which can hopefully yield to us much greater understanding of this very complex but extremely interesting phenomena, which is empathy. So that's all I have time for. And I would like to just thank many people for their help and their wonderful, inspiring ideas and contributions, and many funders, particularly my lab, the Comparative Cognition and Cross-Cultural Development Lab, who are rapidly growing. There's 12 of them, I think, in this photo, or more, possibly. And many of the collaborators, and particularly Lola Bonobo Sanctuary, for being such amazing collaborators and for providing such fascinating insights into these apes, which I hope you'll also consider contributing to if you'd like to help support them. So many thanks, and I'd be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was so great and really, really interesting. And your videos worked absolutely perfectly.
Great.
So yeah, if you would like to stop sharing.
Yeah, stop the share.
We've already.
I just thought I'd show you that picture because I love that photo. That's Maya. Just for everybody here, this is a photo of Maya, who was she was rescued, and she's had a number of offspring at the sanctuary, and that she's actually been reintroduced back into the wild with that little baby. So they're now roaming around in the rainforest and doing really well. So these apes can just never cease to amaze me what they're capable of. So yes.
Yeah. Okay, we've got quite a few really good questions already in the chat.
Oh yeah, 18 questions. Wow. Okay. Yeah, I'll try and answer some.
We're running a few minutes late, so I think we will stay past 2. And I'll put Zanna's email address in the chat, so if anybody needs to go, they can email me.
Yeah, I'm sorry you couldn't hear me very well during the video. I'm sorry about that. So Glenn Roberts, is consolation part of empathy, or is that compassion as a second process following empathy? Surely people can share and understand another without responding well. They may avoid, ignore, exploit, whereas capacity empathy followed by the motivation to relieve suffering seems to be compassionate. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. It's difficult to exactly know without obviously having the kind of verbal sort of responses of apes. But we would argue that empathy, at least consolation, is actually sort of proactively trying to relieve the distress, or it's responding to the needs of the individual. So it probably, it won't have the same level of complexity as compassion would, because I think compassion implies a very much greater cognitive involvement, because not only you understand their needs, you can completely separate them from your own. And actually you can totally appreciate that they're experiencing distress and it's not necessarily yours. Now, we're not clear if that's fully necessary for consolation to be exhibited, because, for example, young apes are showing consolation, functionally they're showing it, but it's unclear whether or not very young children and non-human apes, particularly young non-human apes, are able to do the same. So my argument would be you can probably actually show quite a lot of empathy without necessarily needing that much cognitive involvement. But I think obviously in humans, there is a much higher level of cognitive involvement, which would be compassion. So I think it's tricky for us to say, because we need to do the experimental manipulations of exactly what apes understand. But my hunch is that there may be different forms of empathy, of which not all of it needs to be hugely reflective in its, just while still being effective, if you see what I mean. So I'm not sure if that helps answer that question. We've got a question. Is it possible to measure infant juvenile attachment of chimps and bonobos to their caregiver to see how this affects their empathy? That's a really excellent question. Thank you for asking that. We would love to, well, indeed, we're trying now to look at that in the wild apes, because we're, that's exactly what we're doing with the wild groups that we're studying, is to look at attachment towards the mothers and maternal responsiveness and so on. When I first started studying it in the bonobo sanctuary, I wasn't really paying attention to that. So it's obviously something I've now become more interested in. And we want to look at it, because it could be that some of the mother reared at the sanctuary who aren't showing the same developmental improvements. So some of the mother reared at the sanctuary aren't actually showing high levels of consolation. It could be that their maternal attachment perhaps wasn't as strong than, say, other mothers. So I think our next big question is to understand the role of maternal responsiveness, and that's indeed what we're trying to address in the next sort of 5 years. Based on that. So it's a great question. Vic? Oh, hi Vic. Hello. Do you think that these early trauma can be passed on to the next generation? Well, this is actually one of the things that we find quite remarkable, is that the mother-reared orphans from the sanctuary are themselves, the mother-reared juveniles are themselves offspring of the orphans. But it seems to me that their functioning is very good. Like, I spend a lot of time with these young apes, and they're functioning, systematically shown, but also just my experience of them. So they are good, they're functioning very well. And I think that's a tribute to the rehabilitation, the large social groups that they're in. Of course, it's possible that these are not fully kind of typical apes, because their mothers were orphans themselves. But my sense is that at least by 1 or 2 generations after being an orphan, it seems that things seem to recover. Like, these individuals are being reintroduced back into the wild, and they're functioning well. So it seems that there's a scope for rehabilitation. But I don't know if that's always the case. I think in the sanctuary, it's very, the sanctuary is a really good environment for them, because they get a lot of social support. They have their rehabilitation period with substitute mums. I think all of that makes a massive difference to why the orphans are good mothers, because the orphan mothers don't tend to reject the offspring. They tend to be good mums. But I think it's because there's lots of them in the group, and I think they get social buffering as a result. In relation to the rehabilitation of orphan bonobos, should we think of this as the development of empathy, or the development of pro-social behaviours that result from empathy? Yeah, I mean, again, that's a really excellent question. Like, how are pro-sociality and empathy related? I mean, it's very debated, actually, like whether or not helping, for example, helping in children is related to empathy. Some researchers would say it's not. But I think there are actually a number of, for example, there's really nice research from the lab of Robert Hepak in Leipzig, which shows that helping and pro-social behaviour is related, at least predicted, by a strong emotional reaction, or an arousal response. So children who see someone in need of help but aren't able to help get a strong pupillary response to that experience, and then that response reduces when they do help. So it seems that they are having some kind of emotional motivation for helping. It is in debate, but I would argue that, yes, I think that empathy could, not always. I think there's lots of pro-social behaviours that don't necessarily depend on it. But I think quite a lot of spontaneous helping may be in part driven by these effective mechanisms like empathy. Why do you think the ape's affective component of empathy decreases as they get older? We honestly aren't sure. It may be that it becomes more focused. This is one of the ideas that we're testing, is that it becomes more focused and tailored towards specific individuals rather than to everyone. It may be that they become more emotionally regulated, and they don't need to show it in front to everybody. That there may be costs, for example, to responding to everybody else in the group. particularly in chimpanzees, we know that, you know, there's lots of costs to individuals, so it may be better for them to kind of keep out of the way, whereas infants maybe don't need, there's less risk of an infant when they run and approach someone. So it could be that. But yeah, I think it seems that the hypothesis we want to test is that, does the consolation just become more selective and tailored across age? And they're kind of born with this tendency to do it, and then it kind of gets pruned. That's the idea that we're kind of thinking about. Harry Hall, it seems as though the demographic in the sanctuary is typical. Yeah, that is true. Atypical. Not only do a lot of the individuals have a trauma during their critical period, yeah, but during foster care they're exposed to and learned of human behaviour. That's correct. To what degree do you think this has been affecting data and results? Yeah, well, we know it will affect. I mean, we know certainly that these data. Sorry, the question is, to what degree do you think this has been affecting data and results, and do you predict similar data in a wild population? Well, knowing how human social functioning works, I would predict that individuals who have been orphaned in any situation are going to struggle socially and emotionally. We know in our species that's true, and it seems to me that that would likely be the case in the wild. We know from the very nice work of Kathy Crockford's lab that the young orphans are stunted in lots of aspects of their development in the wild, and they do show some improvements in later adulthood, but they are very affected when they're first in that stage. So it seems that so far the results are compatible relatively. But I do agree that these are unusual apes, and I would say that it shows the flexibility, the plasticity in their social and emotional development, and it also shows that that you really need to look at them across a bigger life period than just one in order to access this question. But I think we're not trying to argue that these are universal features. We want to look at it in the wild apes, which is what we're now doing, but we just haven't had a chance to do it previously because it takes a long time. But hopefully in the next couple of years we can get a better sense of how to answer that question, or we'll have some more data, because we've got access to, well, 2 wild bonobo populations, and actually fortunately some wild chimp populations as well. So hopefully that will help elucidate that question. Great. I don't know if I've missed all the questions.
I think one a little bit further up about does reciprocity affect empathy?
Yeah, we don't have any strong evidence of that. We don't have any evidence really of reciprocity, only in the sense that individuals that are socially close are more likely to console each other, but in a broader sense rather than in a sort of tit for tat way. So we don't have evidence that if you console me on this day, I'll do it for you. But they are biased towards individuals they're close to. So it may be some kind of more the time scale for reciprocity. I guess it would depend on how you look at it. But so yeah, not in a close temporal way, but in a longer kind of in terms of functionality. Yes, individuals that are close to each other are also more likely to console, and the directionality of those two like the cause and causality of those, I'm not sure which direction it goes, but they are connected. I mean, they're like similar in the sense that humans are also more likely to care about someone they're more likely to respond emotionally to someone they care about, and we find the same patterns in the apes. But it's a really good question. We could also track that across time, which is another thing we're trying to do, to see if the patterns of tendencies to console are actually they change across age according to the relationship change. So there's lots of cool stuff we can do to answer that question. But yeah, thank you. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that.
Did I miss any other questions?
Oh,
I think maybe.
Yeah, I think that's.
Yeah, I think those are the main questions. If anyone else has one, you can just say.
I think we'll,
and we do have a hand up.
Oh, a hand. Abiola Fisher.
Oh.
Hello, that's me.
Hello, hi there.
Hello, got a couple of questions for you. Fascinating talk. Thank you very much. Going back to the very original video you showed in the nursery in the UK, I noticed that one kid who ignored the wailing toddler on the floor. So my attention was drawn more to him. Does that indicate that he has less empathy than the other two who responded to the kid on the floor? That's the first question. The second question I have is empathy, not coming from a psychological background, or more anthropology and human origins. I've always associated empathy with consciousness, and now you've given this talk, you haven't actually mentioned consciousness at all, and I'm wondering if we can completely detach the two of them, because if we can't detach the two of them, what we can infer then, if these animals have empathy, then they also have some element of consciousness. So I don't know where you are on that.
Yeah, thanks. Those are two really interesting questions. First of all, so the child not reacting, we have exactly the same issue in the great apes as well. We have many individuals doing absolutely nothing, and they just stare at the individual who's like, in massive distress. What I would say is, observationally, it's impossible to tell. It could be that they are actually just regulating themselves, and they're either sort of being blocked from reacting for some reason. Some individuals, for example, will freeze in that situation. Maybe that strategically they don't care about that individual. It doesn't mean that they're not empathic. It might just mean that they're not empathic towards that individual, because, for example, they don't care about that individual. They might, if you see someone crying that you don't really know, it might not upset you very much versus your brother or sister, for example. So it could be that. It could also be that they are reacting, but they're not showing it, which is one of the reasons why we want to use the thermal imaging to see if these individuals who, despite not showing a behavioural response, are showing an affective response. So you wouldn't exactly call that empathy, but you would call it an emotional reaction to that. They might just lack the motivation. So I think essentially it's difficult to know just observing. It could be a multiple different set of explanations to answer that, and that's why we're trying to triangulate different methods to understand if doing nothing is really doing nothing, or if it's actually there is processes happening underneath. So I think that's I'm sorry it's not really able to answer it fully, but I think that's how we take it. Typically in the primates as well, when they observe a distress, they're not themselves distressed. They approach, but they're not necessarily in distress. And so, they don't outwardly appear to be in distress. So it may be that they are actually able to contain themselves, or they're experiencing, but they're regulating it. Again, that's why we want to use pupil dilation, thermal imaging, and these other measures to try and understand that better. So I hope that answers your question. The other thing about consciousness, I certainly would say that bonobos are conscious. I would say that most animals are conscious to some level, and I think that they may not be necessarily consciously aware of understanding or necessarily recognizing it in the same way as we might. But I think also many human responses, empathic responses, might also not be quite as consciously aware as we think they are. I think a lot of it probably is this intermixing. So I would say that probably, well, I'm sort of pretty certain that bonobos have certain levels of consciousness that overlap with ours. Certainly not all of them, but and to some extent most animals do. So I don't think the consciousness dissociation needs to be an issue, particularly for this. I think that they aren't necessarily reflective about what they're doing, but I would say that they have some minimal, there's likely to be some minimal form of understanding or tracking, which would imply some form of consciousness. So I just think that what I was trying to say with the young apes is that probably, like in humans, you can do a lot without that much conscious awareness. So a lot of human functioning doesn't actually necessarily depend on that much conscious awareness. I think we assume it does a lot more than it actually does. And I think the ape data, particularly the young apes, I would be surprised if those very young infants are necessarily computing it in a very sort of, I don't know, in a highly aware way. I would say it's more of a response reaction that possibly older individuals are more measured in how they respond, which could imply more conscious involvement. But I'm not saying that I wouldn't say they're not conscious at any of them. Yeah.
Okay, cool. There's a couple of questions in the chat that have popped up. If you're,
oh yeah,
you have got time,
is yawn contagion a good predictor of empathy? That is very contentious. Some people would say yes, and some people would say no. So yawn contagion is a form of motor matching, and some studies have indeed shown a good relationship with the same predictors of empathy and the same or consolation and the same predictors of yawn contagion. But there are also quite a few studies that have also shown that the two can be, that yawn contagion doesn't need to be emotional at all. It's more of a motor matching behavior. For example, there's lots of there's studies of yawn contagion in blind people. There's studies showing that it's not necessarily connected to emotional awareness, and so I think it's very disputed. So I would always say that it may be in some contexts yawn contagion might be, but it doesn't have to be. I think that's sort of how I would answer that. Do you think that contact with human beings actually accelerates or rather exacerbates the evolution of empathy in bonobos at Sanctuary? Yeah, I would say that the contact, I think having a substitute mother has improved the social and emotional functioning probably of these individuals. So I think that they probably come in a very traumatized state, but I would say that the improvement across time is likely to be due to the fact they've been given a substitute attachment figure. Because I think if they're not given a substitute attachment, it doesn't need to be human, it can be ape, but they need some form of attachment. I think they're very similar to young children in that respect. And I think that's what sanctuaries are showing us, that like particularly that some of these orphans are now living in the wild, fully functioning. They've been there for 10 years and they're doing well. It suggests to me that substitute mothering is effective. Not always, but it's a good strategy. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So yeah, we'll leave it there. And thank you so much. That was so interesting, and I hope
my pleasure.
Enjoyed it. And yeah, we'll see you next week for a talk by Patrick Roberts, who's going to be talking to us about the ecological and environmental niche of Homo sapiens. So yeah, thank you everybody, and see you next week.
No, you're welcome. Thanks a lot for coming. Bye.